how do you build a collection? And why do you build a collection? I'm going to try and cover a lot of these. I might skip around a little bit, but I hope you enjoy it. Let me talk about this collection. This is an illustration of imaginative literature. All the paintings in here are illustrations from a story. It could be from Don Quixote, from Alice in Wonderland, Lord of the Rings, Princess of Mars. They all are tied in. And you're going to see that certain artists are intimately tied in with certain authors. Many people have illustrated the same story, but some artists tend to really capture the flavor. And have you ever heard some of the authors say, if I had visualized it, this is the way I would have visualized it. One of the things that I also want to tell you is that this is only 60 paintings. This field of imaginative literature, you're going to see, goes back to 1860, 160 years. There's been a lot more than the 40 or 50 illustrators that are here. We can't put everybody into this collection. So it was our choice to pick certain people. How did we pick certain people? We wanted to pick people that we felt were great influences. So we tried to pick at least one illustrator from many European countries. Not every European country, but many. France, Italy, Germany, United Kingdom. Then at the same time, as far as the United States goes, we tried to pick certain illustrators that were dominant in a certain era. Maybe they were dominant in the 1920s or the 1930s or the 1940s. We might have only picked one or two, and yet there might have been 50 illustrators in that era. But we, kind of editor's choice, picked the ones we thought had the greatest influence. One thing about collecting is you need to have a vision. You need to, a lot of people just collect what they like. I don't consider that a collection. A collection has an organizing theme, a principle. Collecting what you like, I'm not putting anybody down who does that, but for me, a collection is set building. If you're going to collect every single New York Yankee baseball card from 1923, that's a set. You know exactly what you're trying to do. And so a collection has a theme. The other thing that we try to do is to impart and share with you the sense of wonder that a lot of these paintings express. For me, that was what got me interested in the field in the first place. And another thing I wanted to talk about is that there has been a big debate in the art world for a long time about what is art. Art, a lot of times you're told that you don't understand the meaning. Only the curators of the museum can explain what it means to you. They take a cloth and wrap it around a building, and you might say, I don't get it. But then somebody will give you a half-hour explanation, but maybe you don't get it. This example here of illustration art is what we call representational art. Excepting for the one that is right over here in the red by Richard Powers, which is very kind of surreal and is not actually representational art. Most of the art here is representational art. You can identify with the characters. Even the monsters look representational, okay? And fantasy comes in many different shapes and forms. There's scary fantasy, like Pickman's model we're going to talk about right over here. There's also beautiful fantasy, like Eleanor Fortescue Brickdale in the back there of the moths flying with the biplane. So there's many different ways to have fantasy as well. We didn't try to organize it around any theme of imaginative literature. We tried to have many different kinds, as long as the artists we felt made some sort of big contribution to the field. To backtrack for a second, my father was a book publisher. He published a line of specialty press books called Shasta Publishers. Over in the corner is the birth of a Shasta book jacket. It explains how the artwork was made for his books. I'm not saying this because he's my father, but many of the of his colleagues said that he had some of the most beautiful books in the field. He used some beautiful artwork, great binding, and great paper. And that made his line of books very well known.
These were wraparound dust covers. The spine would go here, the front of the book would go here, and this would be in the inside, wraparound. And they did 4 colors. It was an expensive printing process, but it yielded some of the most beautiful covers of these specialty press publications. I'm going to start with this painting that's up in the top right-hand corner up here. It's an illustration for an Amazing Stories pulp magazine. John Carter battling the dead in the city of the mummies. And here's the pulp magazine that it appeared on, right here. What was a pulp magazine? A pulp magazine was printed on cheap paper. In the 1920s and 30s, people didn't watch television. They actually read for entertainment. And you would go to the newsstand, and there would be hundreds of pulp magazines. There were science fiction pulp magazines, love pulp magazines, detective pulp magazines, all kinds. Many of these illustrators did work other than just in science fiction or fantasy. So again, we have narrowed it down to not just illustration art of imaginative literature, but made it even more so of imaginative literature because there are other illustrators. A lot of the stories that appeared in these pulp magazines were serialized. And so you had to buy the January, February, March, April to read the entire book. My father, after the Second World War, was one of the first book publishers that took all of the stories from all of the serializations and put them into one first edition hardcover. And that was unique at that time, to have a hardcover edition of some of these books that the fans really loved, and he used great artwork on top of it. So he was a book publisher. He was visiting in Chicago with the publisher of Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer, and that painting was there. And my father was looking at it, and Ray Palmer said, "Do you like it?" And my father said, "Absolutely, I love it." He said, "Take it." Because in those days, illustration art was not considered art. I mean, an artist is somebody who has something they have to get out of them, and they have to express it, right? And somebody who's working for a commercial purpose to sell a book, that's almost like, excuse me, being a prostitute, right? You're not selling yourself, but we look back at it now and we say, wait a minute, no, it's your visualization of it. There's still an art to that. We're going to see that there's 3 or 4 John Carters, like the one up there that I just showed you. John Carter was a character by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And there's 3 or 4 visualizations of John Carter. That one by Jalen St. John, this one by Michael Whalen, and this one by Frank Schoonover. They're all John Carter, but they're different ways of visualizing it. So you can be an artist and visualize something different than somebody else and put your art into it that way. So the pendulum has swung back, and now people are saying, well, gee, maybe representational art, maybe illustration art is art. Mm-hmm. And now you see things like Norman Rockwell paintings selling for $40 million. Mm-hmm. Frank Frazetta, right up here, he did a Conan cover and a Death Dealer cover that sold for $5 million. Mm-hmm. Now that doesn't mean that it's art, but it certainly means that they're getting more accepted than what the illustration art used to be. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you about briefly is the sociological transformation of a field. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the early days, when illustration art wasn't considered art, just like my father, it was given away because they figured it had served its purpose, it illustrated a story, it's not really art. Earl, go ahead and take the painting home. He put it in my bedroom, and it changed my life. I mean, I used to imagine myself in that scene with John Carter, who's up in the air there jumping, fighting the 4-armed Green Martian, who's riding a thoat. What I loved about it is that the city is in a soft focus. You don't see the Martian city. So he leaves it to your imagination to wonder, what is that city? I wish I was closer. I'd like to see what that city looks like. I loved it, and it gave me this sense of wonder.
Another quick story about illustration art. We're going to talk about Frank R. Paul, a friend of my father's by the name of Sam Moskowitz. Worked for one of these pulp magazines, Amazing Stories. He normally would just take the bus home every day. One day, he went to the back of the building to throw away some garbage, and all of a sudden he saw 13 or 14 Frank R. Paul illustrations in the garbage can.
Oh my God.
This was one of them. I got this from Sam Moskowitz's family. And that night he decided to take a cab home instead of the bus. But he saved it from posterity. A lot of pulp art was thrown away because it was not quote unquote art. So the first phase of this collecting field were these fans, and they didn't care if it was art or not. It spoke to them. They could relate to the story. They could relate to the illustration. I think when you're a collector of anything, that's the most important thing to bear in mind. It's not whether the painting is going to go up in value and you're going to make a profit off of it. Because I always say, look, it's going to hang on your wall, and if it's ugly and it's going to go up and triple in value, who cares? You still have to look at it. Enjoy what you're buying. It's got to speak to you. Like that painting up there spoke to me. Another one of my father's friends was affectionately called Mr. Science Fiction, Forrest J. Ackerman. He published a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And Steven Spielberg and George Lucas grew up on that magazine. It explained the dynamics of how, I don't know if you remember these Harryhausen films of Sinbad fighting on, they were all stop action, and explained how all of this was done. Anyway, Ackerman did this magazine, and I asked Ackerman one time, how did you get into the field? He said, well, he had a really dramatic way of talking, well, one day my mother sent me to the pharmacy, and I went down, and I saw all of these pulp magazines. He said, and in those days, pulp magazines could talk. He said, and I saw an illustration by Frank R. Paul, and the pulp magazine said, come over here and buy me, young man. And that's how he got interested in science fiction. Started reading those pulp magazines. So that was the first phase of the collecting field. The fans were collecting this stuff. They were getting it out of garbage cans. They were giving it away. The second phase of this collecting field, I call the entrepreneur part. And that's where, after somebody like Sam Moskowitz had it, maybe some dealer would say, well, to the family, I would like to buy your books and your art, and I'll sell it, and I will keep one of the paintings as my profit. And people would say, fine, it's not going to cost me anything. And so they would build up a collection through entrepreneurship. They didn't have to come up with any money out of their pocket. They could wheel and deal, right? Well, when I started, and I got my father to begin this with me, I was a poor law school person who had just graduated from law school. And I didn't have a lot of money. And so I started doing it through entrepreneurship as well as going with other fans. The third phase of the evolution of a collecting field, I say, is when the nouveau riche come in. The nouveau riche have money. They're not going to go and hang around with fans. They're going to go to auction galleries, or they're going to call somebody up and offer them money. This Stanley Meltzoff illustration over here, we were called by Paul Allen. I don't know if you know who Paul Allen was, but he owns this company called Microsoft with Bill Gates, and his share was worth $26 billion. And he wanted this painting. And I didn't really want to let it go. And he offered me like 4 or 5 times what I paid for it, but I didn't think that I would be able to buy another Stanley Meltzoff as good as this. And by the time I paid taxes and everything else, sometimes a friend of mine told me that sometimes art is worth more than money. And I said, what do you mean? He said, this is a totally unique painting. You can't replace it. A dollar bill, you can replace a dollar bill. But how can you replace something that's unique? This friend of mine was named Gene Nigra. He taught me another thing, too, about collecting. He said on a scale of 1 to 10, there are actually, when you're rating restaurants or art. He said there's actually such a thing as a 12. I said, a 12? What's a 12? On a 1 to 10, how can you have a 12? He said a 12 is something that's a 10, but it's so iconic that it's even above a 10. That would be kind of like Alice in Wonderland we're going to talk about over there by Arthur Rackham. It's so well known. Or The Pit and the Pendulum by Harry Clark. If you Google Pit and the Pendulum, you'll see that Harry Clark illustration. That's a 12 because people just know it. It's associated in their mind. So those are the evolution of the field. As you grow as a collector, your focus changes. You start to really focus on what it is that you want to do. And that's when I started thinking, well, I don't just want everybody in the field. Maybe I just want who I think are the more important people. And you start to really laser focus what you're doing. My father and I went around and we visited a lot of the old collectors that he knew. Basically, science fiction art began in the 1920s. There were science fiction books, and we're going to see some illustrations of fantasy from the 1880s. But in the United States, it started with a gentleman by the name of Hugo Gernsback, who published the first science fiction magazine called Amazing Stories. And his main artist was Frank R. Paul. And now we're talking about the 1920s. My father was born in 1923. He died just a year and a half ago. He was almost 98. He was the posthumous guest of honor at the 80th World Science Fiction Convention last year in Chicago. And they wanted our collection to commemorate him. We exhibited at the Science Fiction Convention. He went at 16 years of age in 1939 to the first World Science Fiction Convention. There were 50 people there. They were all men. They all had suits and ties. And but he knew the old fans. And so we went to some of the old fans' houses. I made some trades with some of them. I traded maybe one of his paintings, my father's cover of one of the books that he had published. He didn't do the art, but he owned the artwork. I traded one of those for one that I liked more. I bought some and did the entrepreneurial thing where maybe I bought 10 paintings and sold 8 of them and kept 2 as my profit. And in those days, you could do that. Today, at $40 million for Norman Rockwell, it's a lot harder to do entrepreneurial stuff. Okay, you've got to have some money to do that. But it all started with that painting. The collection, as it started to grow, when it went to all these places, I had a kind of an epiphany. And I'm going to start with the Princess of Mars here. In the United States, there were 2 kinds of magazines. There were the pulp magazines and there were the slick magazines. The pulp magazines were these cheap magazines that fell apart in your finger after a while, and they were considered beneath the slick magazines. The slick magazines is where Norman Rockwell and Christie and those kind of Leyendecker, where those illustrators appeared. But really, it didn't make them a better artist because they were in fancier magazine, but they had a little bit more pizzazz to them. They were held a little bit higher in esteem. Princess of Mars is done by Frank Schoonover, who was a student of Howard Pyle. Howard Pyle started the first American school of illustration art called the Brandywine the Brandywine School of Art. The Brandywine School of Art. 2 of his famous students were Frank Schoonover and N.C. Wyeth. So this is the kind of slick magazine illustrator that would appear. Remember, there were hundreds of pulp magazines at the newsstand. So American pulp illustrators tended to be more garish and less painterly. Because if you had 100 pulp magazines and you had to stand out and sell the magazine, then you had to have a kind of a garish cover for people to grab your attention, to say, come over here and buy me, young man or young woman. You had to have something kind of garish to do that. Whereas the Brandywine illustrators or the European illustrators were much more painterly. When my father and I went to visit a collector who had a Schoonover illustration, it dawned on me, because up until that time, my collecting goal had been to collect all of these science fiction and pulp illustrators. And then I saw a Schoonover and I said, why am I limiting myself just to pulp illustrators? Imaginative literature can be by many, illustrations of imaginative literature, illustrators can come in many shapes and form. Not only the pulp illustrators, but the slick illustrators, or even the European illustrators. So your collecting goal starts to expand again. And this is how a collector's interest or focus starts to change. But I always kept the theme around imagination, illustrations of imagination, a sense of wonder for me. So that was the unifying principle. Let me tell you a little bit about the collection itself. French illustrator by the name of Gustave Doré. He was very famous. He did illustrations of the Bible, and he was immensely popular. I think he did something like 10,000 illustrations in his lifetime. He was a sculptor, all kinds of amazing things. He did comics. This is Don Quixote. It's the earliest piece in our collection. It's when we started to change and get into the Europeans. Above that is an illustration by Aubrey Beardsley. He was one of the creators of Art Nouveau. It was a theme in art. He was very popular in England around the 1880s. He illustrated some things that were quite scandalous. He was gay in a time when it was not popular to be gay. He illustrated Oscar Wilde's Salome. Oscar Wilde also was a little bit scandalous. Beardsley died at, I think, 25 years old or something like that. But he made a huge impact in the world of illustration. And this is From the Mort to Artur. Next, we come over here. This is all done chronologically. Doesn't mean you have to look at it that way, but for best purposes here to explain it, I'm doing it this way. This is Howard Pyle, the father of American illustration art. He started that school I told you, the Brandywine School of Illustration. His goal was to train American illustrators. He believed that we needed to have illustrators in this country. The printing presses were starting. People were reading a lot. We needed to have illustrators. So he was not only a major artist himself, but he was a teacher. His goal was to train American illustrators to compete with amazing European illustrators like Arthur Rackham. Arthur Rackham is kind of an illustrator's illustrator. If you were to ask most artists, not all, but many artists, who one of the most famous illustrators are, aside from someone like Norman Rockwell, they would say Arthur Rackham. He's kind of the Norman Rockwell of England. We have two Arthur Rackham here. One is Alice in Wonderland, which I told you is very iconic, very well known, and the other is Rip Van Winkle. This picture of Alice is Alice and the Mock Turtle along with the Griffin. Rackham was known for his trees, his gnarly trees, and the line work, that he did. Next, we can look at Sidney Syme here. Syme was a British illustrator. This is an illustration of Fame, and you can see here that there's a wreath that Fame is trying to put on your head, I guess because you're famous, and at the same time, the tree of death here. And he's kind of, again, in that soft focus where part of him you can see and part of him you can't see. One of Rackham's competitors was a Frenchman by the name of Edmond Dulac, who came to England, and he competed and did many beautiful books, children's gift books that were illustrations. This is The Tempest, Full Fathom 5. It's a picture of a mermaid, kind of an Ariel, with the Coral King, who's dead, her father under the bottom of the sea. The third person who was very big, who competed with Rackham and Dulac, was Kai Nielsen. He was Danish. So here you see we're adding a British, a French, and a Dane to our collection. He illustrated a book of Danish folk tales and fairy tales called East of the Sun, West of the Moon. This particular illustration is not from that series, but it is a beautiful example of the pen and ink work that Nielsen did. It's a picture of Paraquat and his betrothed is being carried away by death on their wedding night. So I told you a little bit about how you find when you're building a collection. Sometimes you go to collectors and you make a trade, or sometimes you're an entrepreneur. This painting we found through the internet. We had heard a story that a gentleman by the name of Richard Hardy owned the painting. And all I knew is that he lived in Arizona. That was it. Well, my law firm does probate work. And so we did a search, because we do heir searches. We have to find heirs. We did a search and found 155 Richard Hardys in Arizona. So, well, I guess it's 155. I've limited it down from 350 million in the United States to 155. By this time, I had done 3 books in the field. One was on the illustrator Hannes Bach, which I did with Ray Bradbury. He was kind enough to write a foreword to the book. One on Frank R. Paul, who I told you about down there, where the 14 Pauls were found in the garbage can. I did a book on his art with Sir Arthur C. Clarke of 2001 Space Odyssey. You know, the interesting thing is that these authors are fans themselves. They love this. They grew up with this literature. They grew up with these artists. They love this stuff. So they were, I was saying this earlier this afternoon, as long as you're normal, you can go and meet these people, these famous people, and they want to talk about it just as much as you. They get a little scared when the groupies or the stalkers come, you know. But short of that, they're fans themselves, and they love to help. So I decided to write a letter, the same letter to all 155 Richard Hardys. And it said that I had done a book on Frank R. Paul and one on Hannes Bach, and I was intending to do a book on Frank Schoonover. Later on, I found out that Frank's grandson, John Schoonover, who I'm really good friends with now, had already been working and was almost done with a catalog raisonné on Frank Schoonover. But I was thinking, maybe I'll do a Schoonover book. This would be great. So I said, if you are the Richard Hardy that owns the Princess of Mars, I'd love to take a photo of it. Well, I sent this to 155 people. And for about the first 4 months, I would get letters like, I'm not Richard Hardy, leave me alone. Oh, okay. Or I'd get letters like, I'm not Richard Hardy, but good luck, I hope you find him. So after a couple of months of this, I said, all right, well, it was nice, I gave it a try. And then one day, I received an email, a dramatic email from Richard Hardy, and he knew exactly who he was in the history of all this and what was involved. And it was dramatic in that he said, I am the Richard Hardy who owns the Princess of Mars. Mm-hmm. Just right from the beginning, you could tell that he knew exactly what was going on. And he related this story to me, that his father, Russell Hardy, went to Frank Schoonover in 1950-51 and was looking for a pastoral scene. Now, this painting was done in 1917. In 1952, we're talking about 35 years later, illustration art was still not $40 million for Norman Rockwell, okay? It was still not considered, it was not art in the grand scheme of these curators, or whoever with the cognoscenti. But it was starting to, it would change years later. But as Russell Hardy, his father, was thumbing through the paintings, looking for a pastoral scene, his father, Russell, turned to Schoonover. He said, oh, look, there's John Carter. Uh-huh. And Schoonover was so flattered. He said, you know John Carter? He said, are you kidding? I read all the Burroughs books. I love John Carter. Remember, Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote another series called Tarzan, which might have been even more famous than the John Carter series. Schoonover said, well, it's $50 for the pastoral scene, and since you like John Carter, I'll throw it in for free.
Oh my goodness.
Again, it wasn't considered that much collectible in those days. Russell hand-built this frame, and I spent a lot of money on framing, I think you can see, and I took it to my framer who was really good, and he said, Steve, I can't make a better frame than this. This captures the mood of it. I would leave this frame alone. And after we took it apart, there's actually a little bit more image up here, and I normally never do that, because people like to see everything, but it's just the end of this circle, that's all it is. But I said, given the story that all this happened, I'm not changing this frame. Any rate, he's telling me this whole story, and then he says, and not only that, my father made this handmade frame, and he put it in my bedroom when I was 13 years old. And I'm thinking, well, that's what happened to me. And he said, and he did one better than I did. He said, I loved it so much, I took it with me to Harvard undergraduate and put it in my dorm room. Now, this is an oil on canvas. You don't normally put anything on top of an oil on canvas. We do this because, well, I'm sure you've read the newspaper. There's crazy people that throw paint on art and other crazy things that are going on now. But other than that, he took it to Harvard with nothing over it. And there were, I'm sure, beer parties and everything else going on. Then he took it to graduate school at Princeton. He ended up becoming a nuclear scientist at Los Alamos, and he lived in Arizona afterwards. So I put this letter down and I go, this is great. I found the Princess of Mars. And then I go, this is terrible. Given that story, I'm never going to get this painting from this guy. So I kind of made a white lie. I said, you know, Richard, Russell was his father, I just happened to be scheduled to do a deposition in Phoenix. He lived in Scottsdale in 3 weeks. Bullshit. Sorry, I had something in my throat. And I'd love to stop by. And he said, sure, Steve, come on over. I mean, what was I going to say? I'm stalking you? Any rate, when I got to the house, his wife was standing right here. And she's me, and I'm over here, and I'm shaking her hand. And as I'm shaking her hand, I'm going, hi, how are you? It's nice to meet you, because the painting was right behind her. And then she looked at the painting, and she looks at me, and she goes, you like that? I said, are you kidding? I love it. She says, I hope you take it with you. I can't stand it. And I was like, oh my goodness, thank you, God. This is amazing. So we went out to lunch, and had a beautiful lunch, and I said, Richard, we're trying to reintroduce these artists to a new generation of collectors and artists and fans. And, you know, if you ever decided to sell it, we would love to buy it. He said, I understand, Steve. I don't really want to sell it, but if you'd like to, if you know what it's worth, if you can give me an appraisal. And I said, sure. I had a whole bunch of comps, and I sent it over to him. And my dad said, Steve, when you send this letter, put his name and his wife's name on the envelope and the letter. And put down what you know, the value of the painting. 2 weeks later, they decided to sell the painting. So that's part of the fun of collecting, is, you know, those kind of stories and those adventures of collecting. That makes it a lot of fun. This is Harry Clark. He was an Irish illustrator. He went on later to do stained glass window work. He was very well known for doing Lord Dunsany, who was a horror writer. No, I'm sorry, that's Sidney Simon. I'm so sorry. This is Harry Clark. Excuse me. Harry Clark was an illustrator, and this is an illustration of Edgar Allan Poe's Pit and the Pendulum. What I always like to point out is that if you look at horror, and this is horror. This is a guy who insults somebody. He's tied up, and the pendulum is going to come down and slice and dice him, okay? But yet, if you look at horror today, it's got blood and gore. This is almost a more noble view of horror. I'm not saying that makes it good. It's just not that level of gruesomeness that we have today in horror. And you can almost see the smell of death as the pendulum's coming down here, and the rats are climbing up him in his eyes. It's so powerful. The collector that had this was a British collector. We went to visit him. And again, they're fans. I'm a fan. We love to share the stuff with each other. I went to visit him in England, and I saw that, and I said, wow, I'd love to have that painting. He says, no, I don't want to let it go. And he had it in a closet. He must have had 400 paintings. And I'm like, but it's in the closet. He goes, no, I just want to know that I have it, and I can take it out anytime I want to look at it. And so my wife, Alma, who's not here, she was here this afternoon. She's back at the hotel now, but she really loved it. And she said, oh my goodness, we got to get that, Steve. So after they made us lunch, she went out in the garden. This gentleman had a garden with his wife. And we had some tea, and they were out in the garden. And she came back, and the wife said, we need to sell this painting. And I'm like, what? And I said, what happened in that garden, Alma? She said, I just told her that I loved it. And that is really another secret to collecting. If you have a passion about something, people sense that. They sense your enthusiasm and your passion. And they were getting older and they wanted to share it with somebody else that had a passion. And I always said, thank God for my wife, thank God for Alma, that she was able to get this a pit in the pendulum, which I really love. We did a Sagreus exhibition, and they had the Steven Spielberg War of the Worlds movie right on top of this painting. And you could see how one of the matte illustrators for the film had lifted the alien and used a very similar alien, excuse me, in the film. It's not copyrighted, you can do that. It's not exactly the same, but there's eerily similar. I was saying earlier, I'm fond of the fact that when you have a really great painting, you can't take one thing out of the painting without it losing something. For me, the energy, the electricity in the sky here of the Martians coming in here and sucking the people out of the farmhouse, and the spiral of the trees, and just if you just take any one thing out of this painting, it's just not the same. It's not a whole. There's this energy that Sagreus had, and yet at the same time he's extremely subtle. He can be extremely subtle. This is Chopin playing music for George Sand, who was a free-thinking woman around the early 1900s. She actually smoked cigarettes. Amazing. A woman could do that in the early 1900s. And she could sit in the presence of a man if she wasn't married. She was very liberated. Chopin is playing music here for her. And you can see the spirits of the music, the faces are coming out of the piano as Chopin. It's very subtly done, the way Sagreus does it. And as the spirits come out, this blue mist is making its way over here to George Sand. And half of her face is being enveloped by that blue mist. And yet the other half of the room, the brown part, the blue mist hasn't made its way over to it yet. It's just very subtle, a very beautiful fantasy. Exquisitely done. He's, again, one of my favorite illustrators. He had a great sense of imagination. He had kind of a stiff artistic style. The centipede here and the aliens are kind of crude. But the color and the sense of imagination that he has is just wonderful. And this is the book that Sir Arthur C. Clarke wrote the preface for, and he said a lot of the same things. Paul's imagination was second to none. Many people call him the father of science fiction illustration. This Green Hills of Earth is another Robert Heinlein story. My father published this book in first edition. Okay? And then he said, you know what? We don't do paperbacks, but Signet Books will pay us a lot of money to do the paperback. We'll sell the paperback right edition, because they had bought the whole rights to reproduce from Heinlein. And they got a bunch of money, and they thought they were so smart. Only one thing. Signet and Pocket Books and all these other paperback companies start thinking, we don't need you. We can go to Heinlein ourselves. We can pay him 5 times whatever you're going to pay him, because we got big money. And my dad realized that he was patronizing his own genocide by selling these paperback rights. And he ended up, bringing these big boys and girls into the field, who eventually started to put him out of business. His specialty press, he decided he wanted to expand the specialty press, and he started doing things like a beauty book, the Westmore Beauty Book. Before he had to close down his company, he had a book by Wilhelmer Stephenson, who was the last explorer of one of the last explorers of the North Pole, that he was ready to get to print. But the company didn't make it. He lost a lot of money in this Westmore Beauty Book, and he had to close down, put the stuff in storage in 1959, and then, as I said, in 1984, I got him to take some of it out, and he and I began going around and building the collection up.
My father died a little short of 98. The last 10 or 15 years, my wife helped me. And as I told you, she went in the garden and did a lot of things that my father and I couldn't do, and was a great help to us in helping build the collection. So it was definitely a family affair. In the 50s and 60s, it was Frank Kelly Frias who added a kind of a comic book look, as well as Ed Emschmiller, who added a kind of a computer technology look to the field, and Richard Powers, who added a kind of an abstract look to the field. I love all three of the looks. The science fiction and fantasy was changing. This is the Sounds of Thunder. And as she's blowing this horn, and the aliens are coming off of the spaceship, it's slowly, the way she's beating them, it's kind of like Joshua won the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, as she's blowing this horn, it's smashing their helmets. And the sound, and they can't breathe anymore. She's defeating them by blowing that horn. And then, of course, the importance of Richard Powers is that as science fiction and fantasy literature began to become more mainstream and accepted, that there were great authors in the field, they wanted to include it in libraries. But the problem was the garish look of the pulp covers. They didn't want to have those books and magazines in those days in the university or the museum or the university libraries. So Richard Powers changed the look of science fiction and fantasy and had this kind of abstract where you could kind of read anything you want into this cover. The aliens, and they weren't garish. It was almost kind of Dali-like, Salvador Dali-like, and so it was very much accepted. And you could add this to the library. Another self-taught illustrator, another big fan, and as I said, Ray Bradbury wrote the introduction for my book on Hannes Bach. He was used quite a lot for Shasta books. They made a little note here that whenever you see Bach's name, it looks like a creature. It's basically his name that, if you look this way, it's B-O-K. But the way he turned it, it looks like it's an alien. Yeah. It's quite cute. His actual name was Wayne Woodward, and he didn't like that name, and so he changed his name after Johann Sebastian Bach to Hannes Bach. But again, here's a horror painting, and the monster is almost demon-like with his white eyes. That just says it all right there. You don't have to have blood, just those white eyes. And the way he's holding the human, who's almost pathetic in his hands and powerless. He can't do anything against this creature. This was based off of a very famous H.P. Lovecraft story, Pickman's Model. This was the Slaves Asleep illustration for the Shasta book. There's a story behind this painting as well. When I got my father to take the stuff out of storage, we couldn't find this painting. It wasn't in storage. And my father says, I know I put it in storage. Well, it was a small field. It's getting to be a bigger field now. But we asked around, and we found that a dealer had heard of its whereabouts, almost a little bit like the Princess of Mars out in California, but we heard the collector's name who had it. So my father and I wanted to make sure that this collector actually had it. And my dad said, look, if we tell them that I'm Earl Korshak, they'll never let me in the door if they know that, because I'm the publisher of the book, and they might think, well, I'm the thief, and I can't let him know that I have the painting. So my dad said, I'm Earl Leeser, and I want to bring my son Steve Leeser, and we want to see the painting, because, again, like the Schoonover, we're doing a book on Hannes Bach, and we want to take a photograph of the Bach. So everything went really well. I'm an attorney. This gentleman was an attorney. I don't want to mention names because this ended up being a big lawsuit. And I went to the University of Chicago undergraduate. He went to the University of Chicago undergraduate. We got along very well. And we were having a glass of wine, and his wife walks in, and he goes, honey, I'd like you to meet some collector friends of mine. And my father walks over, and he says, hi, how are you? Earl Korshak. And the guy goes, Earl Korshak? I thought you were Earl Leeser.
And my dad goes, well, I better tell you the truth. This painting was stolen out of storage, and unfortunately you don't have good title to it. A thief cannot pass title to something that they don't own. And the gentleman's story was he bought it from a collector. He never got a bill of sale. He doesn't know where the collector got title to it from. It was from a thief. So he didn't want to give the painting back. We filed a lawsuit. Forrest J. Ackerman, Mr. Science Fiction, who was told, come over here and buy me, young man. The great raconteur came to the trial, had the jury in the palm of his hands. He was such an amazing storyteller. And he said, yes, this is the original Slaves Asleep. And he looked at the postcard that my father had from Hannes Bach, which said, I received the $50 for the painting. It's yours to keep. So we had proof of title, and Ackerman established it. This other gentleman couldn't prove title. The jury voted in our favor. One of the jurors came over and said, we really wanted you to have this painting. It was a piece of family history. The story doesn't completely end there, because years later, this is an illustration, Slaves Asleep, by L. Ron Hubbard. Does that name ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
Dianetics, the Church of Scientology. Well, my dad was offered to publish Dianetics. Hubbard was one of his authors and said, Earl, I've written this book about the science of self-help. Would you like to publish it? Now, this was before Earl was selling paperback rights and didn't realize that he was patronizing his own genocide. And he said, I'm a science fiction publisher. I don't think I should publish that. That's not science fiction. It's medical self-help. Little realizing that next to the Bible, it's one of the most published books in the world, because everybody who believes in that has to buy that book. And Hubbard, by the way, according to my dad, was just a wonderful, entertaining person. He was a member of the Explorers Club. He had told my dad that one of the reasons he wanted to write this book and start a religion is because he wanted to save money on taxes. But he had a great boat. They would go out together in the boat. They were great friends. And he was just a wonderful gentleman. I'm not going to get into this because I remember one time I made a comment about something, and the next day I got a cease and desist letter. But I'll just say that Scientology has changed. I'm not going to say how, but it's changed since Hubbard is not involved in it. We'll leave it at that. So they came over to our house and said, we really want to buy that painting. And I said, well, that's great, but I really don't want to sell it. Well, you don't understand. This is by St. L. Ron Hubbard. He's our founder. We really want that. I said, well, you don't understand. My father published this book, and we had a lawsuit, and I really want to keep this painting. And they said, well, what would you sell it for? And I said, well, I don't want to sell it, but what would you sell it for? $1 million. $1 million is not worth that. I said, I know, I don't want to sell it. They said, well, we don't have $1 million. I said, well, if you really wanted that bad, have Cruz or Travolta write $1 million check and you can buy it, because I don't want to sell it. So that was the end of that discussion. But Hannes Bach was a major influence in the field in the 1940s with Virgil Finlay. They competed with each other. This was a visualization of John Carter done by Frank Frazetta. He's kind of a dividing line. His work he was working in the early 50s and 60s, but in the 70s, when Frankel introduced him to heroic fantasy, he reestablished himself and really just took off. He did total iconic illustrations of Conan the Barbarian and Death Dealer. Death Dealer is this character where he has a helmet and you just see blood on his sword and blood in his eyes. And he's used on many of the gamer, the reproduction on the gamer, artwork, the video gamers. He was influenced by Frazetta. Frazetta was influenced by St. John. He kind of had a very polished St. John look. You remember how I told you St. John had a soft focus? Well, Frazetta was much more detailed. He didn't leave a lot to the imagination like St. John did. A different style. This is another John Carter, just like visualization of John Carter, just like Frank Schoonover did a visualization of the Princess of Mars.
J. Allen St. John did a visualization of John Carter. This was a visualization of John Carter done by Frank Frazetta. Frazetta, I think I mentioned some of his artwork's been going for $5 million, a Death Dealer and a Conan. This is by Brian Froud. He's a British illustrator. He worked on the movie Labyrinth and Dark Crystals for Jim Henson. And this is kind of a fossilized troll. This little boy is walking in the woods. He sees a fossilized troll that he can almost walk over like it's a bridge. It's just a beautiful piece, and it influenced Henson to use him, kind of like I told you, Disney brought over Gustav Tangren to do Snow White. This influenced Jim Henson to do Dark Crystals and Labyrinth. Michael Kaluta, who's a comic book illustrator. And you know, most comic book artwork is black and white, and then they put the color in it later on. And it's usually big, long, broad strokes and a lot of pencil work. But this one, the detail on this comic art, this shows how fantasy and science fiction morphed from pulp magazines into paperbacks and into comic books. And the amount of detail that's in this Kaluta painting is striking. If you look at the detail on the side here, it's just awesome. This is an illustration by the brothers Hildebrand. They were twins. One of them would be working on a painting and then go to the bathroom, and his twin would be working and step over and start filling in what the other twin hadn't finished while he was in the bathroom. They were twins that worked together. I wanted to tell you that when Frazetta, Conan had been around. This is not a Conan cover. This is a John Carter cover. But it's reminiscent of Conan because he's a barbarian here and he's slashing and killing and everything else. Conan had been around, Robert E. Howard's story, since the 30s. Margaret Brundage, who I mentioned earlier, had painted Conan. It never really took off. When Frazetta did the covers in the late 60s and early 70s, it started selling 1 million copies. My dad was lucky if he sold 10,000 copies of a science fiction or a fantasy book. 1 million copies. People were taking the covers, throwing away the book, and just keeping the cover because they loved the art so much. But it started a whole trend into Robert E. Howard and his interest. Well, the brothers Hildebrand had a similar effect. Lord of the Rings had been around for many years, but they started doing these calendar covers. I think this is 1977. Do you remember the scene in the movie where Gandalf says, "You shall not pass," and he puts that his magic staff down. Thank you. Puts this staff down. Well, that's the scene right here, and it's the exact same scene. These covers, these calendar covers, like the Frazetta, sold 1 million copies, and that was unheard of. And I have to believe that must have influenced somebody like Peter Jackson 20 years later or so when he did the film. Somebody, if he could sell 1 million copies of a calendar. The last I'm going to end with is Michael Whalen. A good friend with Michael. He's one of the most important illustrators in the field. I asked Michael one time how he would compare himself with Frank Frazetta. His wife, Audrey, answered it. She said, "Well, Steve, I always considered Frazetta to be more of oh my goodness, Elvis Presley. Nothing but very primal, right? Elvis Presley." And she said, and my husband, of course, who she loved very much, to be much more the Beatles. But yet, Frazetta has the bigger name in the art market, not in the science fiction field. The highest award they give to the science fiction award is called the Hugo Award, named after Hugo Gernsback, who was the first editor of Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazine, the Hugo Award. Well, Michael Whalen won it for something like 14 out of 15 years. Nobody had ever done that. And finally, and this was in the prime of his career, he said, "I would really like my name not to be considered anymore because there's so many great other artists that I think are not getting attention." And so he withdrew his name from any further, but he would probably still have won another 15. He's a fan favorite. Our first exhibition at the Korshak Museum in Orlando, Michael graciously flew down with Audrey, his wife, and gave a little talk. 300 people came to the Orlando Library to hear him talk. And then we had a little appetizers and cocktails, hors d'oeuvres over at our house. He and Audrey came, and we were sitting in the living room, Audrey and Michael and my wife and I, and there were other people in the museum and other rooms, and we were talking, and Michael said, "Excuse me, I've got to go to the restroom." So he went to the restroom. About 10 minutes later, he said, "Excuse me, Steve, I've got to go to the restroom." 10 minutes later, "Excuse me, Steve, I've got to go. Excuse me, Steve, I've got to go." Finally, after about the fourth or fifth time, I said, "Michael, are you okay?" He said, "You don't understand." He said, "This Edmund Dulac painting right here behind you," he said, "with the predominant blue tones, was one of the greatest influences in my life, because I realized that you could have a predominant tone in a painting and still have it be very strong and realistic looking." And he said that this Dulac painting is right by the bathroom. So that's what I keep going over and looking at. And if you look in Wayland's early works, he had in this painting a predominant blue tone. In this painting, this is an Elric illustration. He's a demon slayer, a predominant red tone. And that's why Michael kept excusing himself. Anyway, that's a little history of the collection and a little history of collecting. And I want to thank you for listening. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have. Thank you.